Today we're going to cover what I find to be one of the most interesting categories of psychiatric psychological disorders, and that is the group known as the personality disorders. I'm going to go a little bit into the history of personality disorders, more so than what I normally do with other psychiatric disorders, because there was from DSM-4-TR to DSM-5 that really pertained specifically to how we train and how we categorize and how we talk about disorders, and personality disorders really is affected by this change, okay? So before I get into talking about how personality disorders are different and how they're categorized, I want to do a really brief history lesson about that fundamental change that happened, or one of the fundamental changes that happened from DSM-4-TR to DSM-5. And that was the removal of something called the multi-axle system. So in DSM-4-TR, we had what's called a multi-axle system, and then in the DSM-5, it was determined that there really wasn't a scientific reason for dividing the disorders into these 5 different axes. From a practitioner standpoint, I miss the multi-axle system so much, because while it may not have been the most scientific, and as a psychologist, I have to bite my tongue when I say that I'm trying to advocate for something that's not necessarily scientific, but it was so functional. It worked so well. The multi-axle system essentially helped us to categorize and qualitatively describe what was going on with somebody in a 5-axis system. So multi-axle meaning 5 different axes or 5 different categories, okay? So I'm going to skip over axis 1 and 2 because those are both diagnoses. Axis 1 being primarily psychiatric diagnoses, axis 2 being where the personality disorders and a couple other things went. Okay, so axis 1 and axis 2 were just the different diagnoses within the DSM. Axis 3 was all about medical conditions. Okay, and because we don't have the multi-axle system anymore, I talk about this when we talk about DSM-5, but it was so clean with this multi-axis system. So when we would develop a diagnosis, a differential diagnosis, and then a diagnosis, we would set it up as a multi-axle diagnosis, and it'd be axis 1, axis 2, axis 3, axis 4, axis 5. Axis 3 were general medical conditions. Okay, so if I were to put this onto a piece of paper and hand it to you and say, based upon my psychological analysis, here is what I'm seeing as being problematic based on the symptoms you're presenting, okay? Axis 1 and 2 would be all the differential diagnoses that I think may be present. Axis 3 would be all the medical issues that you tell me that you have. Why is this important? If you're coming in and saying I'm depressed or I'm anxious or I'm hearing voices, why do I need to go know medical conditions? Because remember, everything that I do as a clinician, as a psychologist, I'm doing knowing that I'm not the only person in the room, figuratively. I am a part of a multisystemic team. If somebody is struggling with a psychological or psychiatric issue, it is best practice that we have a multi-systemic team, including psychologists, psychotherapists, social workers, psychiatrists, neurologists, general practitioner. If it's a child, the child doctor. All these things, we have all these people around the table. And so if I'm looking at a problem solely as a psychologist, I'm going to miss some things. And so I want to know what your medical conditions are because I want to be able to figure out, or I want somebody else to be able to say, hey, this may not be psychological, this may be something else. For example, if you have somebody who identifies that they are type 2 diabetic, but they come in and they tell me, I'm always feeling down, I'm always feeling depressed. Don't I need to know that they're type 2 diabetic? Because maybe their blood sugar is messed up. If their blood sugar is constantly low, they're going to feel down. And so I can do therapy all day long for years. Am I ever going to cure, using that term if you're not watching me, air quotes, cure depression if one of the major root causes is low blood sugar? No, that's why axis 3 is so important. Axis 4 really speaks to the psychosocial factors. Again, axis 4 is all what are the things going on outside of this person's life, or outside of the session, outside of you know, what's going on internally with the brain, with the mind, with the body, you know, what are the factors that may be contributing to this problem? Okay, so axis 4 is, you know, I just got fired from my job, or my wife left me, or my husband left me, or my kids don't like me, or I don't have money to pay for medications. You know, all these things that definitely are going to contribute. Again, if somebody doesn't have money for food, I can do therapy to try to make them feel better about their depression all day. But you know what? If they don't have food, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? How am I going to make them feel better about their situation when their situation, let's be brutally honest, their situation sucks? They could do 3 hours a week with me, or I could give them, you know, I could set them up with $5 a day to get hamburgers from McDonald's, and they would be better. So that's what axis 4 was about, for us to identify what the problems were. Axis 5, I'm not a real big fan of. It's called the GAF score, Global Assessment of Functioning. It's basically a quantitative way of trying to assess how a person is doing. The reason I never liked this is because it was never implemented very well. I had different clinicians who would use different scales, even though it's right here. The way that I always saw this as being the biggest problem was when I was working in a residential facility. If you look at the number 50, so 100 would be, you are psychiatrically Superman. You have nothing, you have no problems. Actually, I think anybody who has 100 as a GAF actually probably has a lower GAF, because they are completely minimizing any problems they might be having in their life. But I had 2 different staffing psychiatrists who told me that if you look at the number 50, serious symptoms, serious impairment, social, occupational, school functioning, I was working with kids at the time, and they were either being admitted or they had been admitted to a residential program. And I had one staffing psychiatrist who said, if they were being admitted or they were admitted to a residential facility, they cannot have a GAF above 50. It's just that's not how the GAF works. And I had another staffing psychiatrist who told me, unless they are actively suicidal or having psychotic issues, they can't have a GAF below 50. So I could literally have a person sitting in front of me, a child, and based upon whether they were coming in to the facility or not, I had one staffing psychiatrist who said they should never be below 50, another who said they should never be above 50. So I just didn't like it, okay? But I loved axis 3 and I loved axis 4. That was really awesome. And then axis 1 and 2 really helped people determine what the heck was going on with personality disorders, okay? So if you look here at axis 1, it's darn near everything in the DSM. You have your anxiety disorders, your depression, your bipolar, your schizophrenia, your eating disorders, sex disorders, adjustment disorders, impulse control disorders, all these things. And the way that I differentiated that from axis 2, which are personality disorders and developmental disorders. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, plus what we called in DSM-4 mental retardation, what we call today intellectual disability, and things like Down syndrome, autism, those fell in axis 2. Okay, the way that I could kind of differentiate this was axis 1 are things that act upon you. You have schizophrenia, you have bipolar, you have depression, but it's not you. And this is a little bit of an aside, but one of the things that I always try to encourage students not to do, especially if you're going into the health and human services or medical field, people are not, you are not a schizophrenic. You are not a bipolar. You're a person with schizophrenia. You're a person with bipolar. I know it's linguistics, but it is something that is thrust upon you. Axis 2, on the other hand, really are fundamentally, they're not thrust upon you, they are who you are. If you have a personality disorder, it is who you are, okay? And that, I'm gonna come back to this point because it's a little harsh, but if you have mental retardation, now intellectual disability, we're not going to get rid of that. It is a thing that says that this is how you are fundamentally. If you have autism, the whole Cure Autism Now logo is something that I just grind my teeth when I hear it, because autism is not something that you cure. We don't get rid of it. We can make you somebody with autism who can function a little bit better in society. We can increase your coping mechanisms. We can increase your functionability, but we can't get rid of mental retardation, intellectual disability. We can't get rid of autism because that's who you are fundamentally. And when it comes to a personality disorder, it's who you are. We're not going to give you a pill that's going to get rid of borderline personality disorder. Okay? So when we used to have Axis 1 and Axis 2, it was awesome because you could kind of differentiate. Like, these are the things that we're gonna work on to try to diminish, get rid of the symptoms. With Axis 2, we're gonna work on you. We're gonna work on the individual. Okay? So now let's get back into the actual lecture. I know I've been talking now for 10, 15 minutes, and I haven't even been on the actual lecture. I apologize, but I think that that's something that's very important. You know, even though you know, you're not going to be a historian of psychology, I think it's really important that everybody understands kind of where we've made changes throughout time, because it shows kind of how we've progressed in the field of psychology and psychiatry. Okay, so now we're going to get into describing exactly what personality disorders are. Okay, so we'll start with a very simple definition because it's been a little while since you took Psych 101. You may forget what personality is. I'm sure you know what it is. You know you have a personality. You know other people have personalities. But the definition of personality in the realm of psychology is the enduring patterns of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about the environment and oneself, which are exhibited in a wide range of important social and personal contexts. That's a really wordy definition, right? Personality is who you are, your default you. It's who you are in most situations. It is the baseline from which people expect you to behave and respond and think and emote, okay? Your personality is not who you are at every single moment. Sometimes those are emotions. Sometimes those are personas. Right now, your underlying personality is who you default to, but your persona right now is that of, I'm assuming, if we were face-to-face in class right now, your persona would be that of a student, okay? Your natural personality probably is not to sit and stare at somebody for an hour and listen to them talk and write down what they say and not speak and not do certain things. That's your persona. It's the persona of a student. Just like if you go to work, you put on a different persona than, you know, if you go out tonight with some friends, you go to the club, you go to the bar, you go out for dinner, you go to a movie, you go to the casino, you know, whatever it is you do for fun, you go to a game. Do you act the same way if you go to a sporting event as you do when you go to church or when you go to class? No, because that's your different persona. But your personality is the underlying traits and types that make you who you are. So basically, we can take personality disorder and just say that it's a problem of the personality. But this is a science, so we have to make it really complicated. So personality disorder, technical definition: enduring patterns of perceiving, relating to, and thinking, so that's personality, about environment and oneself that are exhibited in a wide range of important social that are inflexible, maladaptive, significant functional impairment, subjective distress. What does that really mean? It means that, simple. If I were to ask you this as an essay question, you don't need to remember this. You need to put two facts together that you should know. One is, what's a personality? It's the enduring patterns of how we interact with the world. And if it's a disorder, we default to the 4 Ds. So all of this stuff right here is basically a long way of saying, if I have a personality disorder, it's the way that I interact with the world, but for some reason it's dysfunctional. It's distressing, it's dangerous, it's deviant, and or it's dysfunctional, okay? That's really a very oversimplified way to look at every single one of our categories. If you look at mood disorders, what is mood? Mood is the way that we are emoting and emotionally feeling about our environment, our internal world, and our external world. So a mood disorder is having deviance, danger, distress, dysfunction towards our mood. And they put that definition together, boom. A little bit like math. Put A together, put B together, and you get AB. Or you can say you can get C. So if you take, you know, affective dysregulation disorder, that's really, so A plus B, affective dysregulation is where we have these variances from depression to mania disorder. We go 4 Ds, you put those together, A plus B, you get C, which is bipolar disorder, okay? Kind of simple, overcomplicated, but kind of simple. So what are the main features of personality disorders? Okay, so I've already alluded to this just a tad. And I preface this by saying that, first, if you have never studied or you don't know about personality disorders, you are going to leave this in the next 45 minutes. You are going to fully embrace the fact that you have anywhere between 4 and 7 personality disorders. And you don't, I hope, but you don't, okay? Remember, dysfunction. Just because some of these things match up with you, if you're not dysfunctional, it's not a disorder, right? Okay, so if deviant, we're all deviant when it comes to personality. Dangerous, most of these aren't all that dangerous, a couple are. Distressing, yeah, but guess what? That's interpersonal relationships. I know for a fact, not everybody likes me. Not everybody gets my personality. I don't want to hang out with everybody. Not everybody wants to hang out with me. That's fine. Does that mean that I'm deviant or distressing? You know what? My personality is distressing to some people. Your personality is distressing to some people. Extroverts, people who are way extroverted and are high on life, that distresses me because gosh darn it, I need to decompress and be by myself sometimes. That doesn't mean it's dysfunctional, doesn't mean it's deviant, it just means it's different, okay? So it's not a disorder unless it's a disorder, okay? The other thing, and I don't want to be flippant about this, this is very, very serious when I talk about this aspect. For me, personality disorders are one of the hardest things to diagnose, and I'm going to use a different term here. It's one of the most difficult things to label someone. Diagnosing is just labeling, okay? And here's why. If I'm working with somebody and I believe that they have bipolar disorder, they have bipolar disorder. Remember, axis 1, they have it. It's thrust upon them. And if not for the fact that they had bipolar disorder, they wouldn't be dysfunctional. Okay, so if we get rid of the bipolar through medication, through psychotherapy, they're all good, okay? Personality disorders, and I'm going to say this simply, and then I'll explain it a little bit more because I don't want to be flippant, but I think it's a simple statement makes people understand this much better. A personality disorder, fundamentally, if I'm telling you that you have a personality disorder, I'm not saying you have a disorder or disease that if that's not there, you'd be fine. I'm fundamentally saying there's something wrong with you. Your personality is you. So when I'm saying you have a personality disorder, there is something functionally and structurally wrong with you. In short, and again, I'm not being flippant with this, but I feel like when I tell somebody that I think they have a personality disorder, in some way I'm saying, you know what? You suck. There's something about you. And I say, and that's, I'm saying this paraphrasing, but I can understand why somebody would think that way because I'm saying that who you have either developed into through nature or nurture or who have you become, who you decided to be, there's something wrong with you. And that's bad. I mean, to say to somebody because that's who they are. And we're saying that you are deviant because of who you are, okay? Now, that's a very short way of saying it, okay? The longer way of saying it is that there's something about you that makes you dysfunctional. And it may not be something that you choose, or it may be, but maybe you don't realize it, or maybe you do, but you just can't do anything about it. And that's what we can work on. So the main features are extremities. The way that people think and feel and behave are going to have extreme deviations from what is considered to be normal. And again, I'm not going to belabor the point of defining abnormal again. We know this by now, but it's deviating extremely from what we accept as normal. These patterns usually begin in early life and remain stable because remember, your personality remains relatively stable. There are certain times where there may be traits that may change. It's not uncommon for somebody who goes from, late childhood into adulthood to change things like introversion and extroversion. That is not uncommon, but it's very uncommon for somebody to have a complete personality change in the absence of some kind of neurological or catastrophic event, okay? That being said, and I can't speak for all clinicians, but I will speak for myself and I'll speak for what I believe to be best practice. We do not diagnose people under the age of 18, and I even have pushed that back a bit myself. It used to be 18. We don't diagnose somebody with personality disorder before the age of 18 because your personality is not set. are you the same person you were at 16? Do you have the same personality as you? And some of you, that's a couple years. For some of you, that's ages ago. I know I'm not the same person I was when I was 16. And I had some traits, some types. My personality type was significantly different. So sometimes people grow out of these things. And some of these personality disorders are very indicative of a childish way of thinking. And again, take that with a grain of salt. It's not meant to be an insult. But some of these we look at and we say, well, that's how teenagers act. Well, yes, that's how teenagers act. But if you do that as an adult, then it's problematic, okay? But in my opinion, like I said, when I used to work with kids, I would, in the back of my mind, I would say, wow, this person's really exhibiting some borderline personality disorder, some antisocial personality disorder, but I'm not going to diagnose them with that. I'm going to diagnose them with something similar that is transitive, that if it remains into adulthood, then it's probably going to be a personality disorder. So a great example of this would be, we haven't talked about childhood disorders explicitly yet, but if I had a 15-year-old who was exhibiting symptoms of conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder being really poorly defined, in my opinion, disorder, but it's basically somebody who behaves in such a way that they are probably going to have interactions with the legal system. They're going to get arrested, they're going to get in trouble, and they don't seem to really care, or it doesn't seem to faze them that they're doing these illegal, immoral, bad things. So as the 16 or 15-year-old doing that, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, where kids who just don't like authority, they're oppositional to everything. Those things could, as adults, be some very significant personality disorders, but that might just be a childhood phase they're going through. It might be situational. Kids are in situations where they're not in control. So, I used to say 18 was the time. I'm now more so of the thought that personality disorders really shouldn't be considered until 22, maybe even 25, and not so much age as a chronology, but age as a are you your own agent? If you're 22 and you're still living at home and you're going to college, maybe you have a job, but you don't have total autonomy, you don't have total agency, I don't think your personality can really be, it's not an indication of who you really are. However, if you're 18 and you're on your own and you're making your own decisions and you're autonomous, then I think personality is pretty much formulated. So it's dynamic. Okay, so I'm not saying it's about age. I think it's about when a person is their own agent. So that being said, some people will diagnose children with personality disorders, and you know what? It's to each his or her own. I just don't think that's personally. I don't think that's really appropriate. Personality disorders are inflexible and maladaptive. Obviously, they're disorders, so they have to be maladaptive. If you have a personality where you're just an awesome person and everybody likes you, well, then that's a personality trait or type, but it's not a disorder. We don't need to change that, okay? So it's inflexible and maladaptive, and it's dysfunctional, okay? What did I just do? I just described the 4 Ds again, okay? But giving you more context. So we're always defaulting back to danger, deviance, distress, dysfunction, okay? All right. The DSM-5, DSM-4 more so, but DSM-5 continually, takes a categorical approach to personality disorder. So it's based on the medical model of symptoms add up to disorder, and the disorder is either there or not there. So if you have 4 out of 9 symptoms that are attributable to borderline personality disorder, it's absent, it's not there, okay? If you have 6, it's there. So it's categorical. You fit the category, you're in a category. It is, and I know this term has some very social connotation, but it's binary. And binary doesn't mean, one or A or B. Binary is 1 or 0, on or off, yes or no. And so it's either present or absent. So personality disorders and a categorical approach is very binary. Either you hit it, you're there, or you don't, okay? So in this personality pathology, dimensional models are are slightly different, okay? So dimensional means we're going to look at the dimensions that vary from normal personality versus categorical, where we're going to just say you have to fit these criteria and then you fit the criteria. We're going to look at these criteria and then you're going to fit the category of a personality disorder. So this is kind of a good time to take a small step back and talk about categorical versus dimensional, okay? Because personality disorders really fit into these categories very well, and it determines how you're going to view personality disorders, okay? So categorical means I can put you into a category, okay? So in next year, I believe it's next year, we're gonna have our every 10-year census in the United States, and you're going to be asked tons of questions. One of them is going to be about your race, okay? Back in I think the 50s or 60s, maybe even closer to the 80s, the categories to which you would put would be, and they use slightly different terms, but I'm gonna just use kind of the ones that we use today. There would be white or Caucasian, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, other, okay? So you have to put yourself into a category, okay? So that's not the way we tend to look at ourselves, but that's how we tend to look at other people. We categorize ourselves. Think about all the people, it's really popular to do those like 23andMe's right now, where you send off your saliva or your blood or whatever it is, something, hair, and then they tell you how much of a percentage you are of each potential different race or ethnicity or where you come from. That's dimensional, okay? The dimension is, I've never done one of these, but send it off and I'm 23% Scottish, and I'm 23% Irish, and I'm 10% English, and I'm 5% German, and I'm 2% Chinese, and I'm 4% Egyptian, all these different things, okay? That's dimensional. I'm looking at the dimensions of what makes me, but when I come to the census, I'm gonna have to check a box. I'm gonna have to fit a category, okay? So your grade, if you look in your grade book, you are worried about the categories, the categorical way that you get graded. At the end of the semester, am I going to get an A, B, C, D, or F? Okay, that's the category. Dimensionally, you look at your grade book and you say, you know what? I'm getting 93% on my exams. I'm getting 97% on all my quizzes. I'm getting 82% on all my discussion boards. I'm getting 71% in class participation. It's important to look at the dimensions to say, wow, I need to pick it up on class participation, or, hey, I'm rocking it on exams. Dimensional gives us really good information about individuals. Categorical lets us categorize. So you can have a dimensional where your exams, your quizzes, your papers, you're getting 90% on those. But you had to give a speech and you got up there and passed out and just started seizing, not medically, you just like gave up, and you got a 20% on that, okay? So categorically, you have a B in the class, but dimensionally, we know that you are getting all this stuff, it's just you missed out on one small part. So dimensional gives us more information. Categorical allows us to kind of categorize people, and it lets us work better with large groups of people, but dimensional is what I want to look at when I'm working with an individual, okay? So that's how we categorize people, but we want to look at things dimensionally. When we look at personality, again, hopefully this is a review from Psych 101, the big 5 personality traits. Remember, traits are ways in which we act in normal situations, and the big 5 personality are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It's the, if you need to remember this as a mnemonic device, OCEAN, okay? So the personality traits these are identified as one side of it. So extroversion, the other side is introversion. So you would either score high on extroversion or low on extroversion, and that implicitly means you scored high on introversion. Conscientiousness, if you're high on conscientiousness, that means that you pay attention, you show up on time, you do all the things that employers would love to see. If you're low on conscientiousness, that just means that you don't have that trait, okay? So those are the big 5, and that's not the only 5. If you remember, Raymond Cattell came up with the 16 PF, the 16 personality factors. That's basically the same thing. They're binary, extroversion versus introversion. So the big 5 are the big ones. There's 16, there's more than 16. If you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs, that's the assessment where you get a 4-letter acronym, INTP, ENFJ, whatever it might be. And that's going to tell you your personality type, and that's made up of traits, okay? So these traits are basically the big things that we look at when we differentiate. If I explain to you that I have a assistant professor who's coming in next week to teach for me because I can't be here. This isn't true, but let's just say, and I tell you that they are very conscientious, they're extroverted, they're agreeable, they're not very neurotic, so that, they're not, they don't pick apart everything, and they're not very open to new experiences, okay? You cannot then know exactly who that person is, but it gives you a great idea about who they are. Most all dating profiles kind of try to talk to these personality traits because these are things that people find to be easy to be able to match up to people. Like, I don't want somebody who is not open to new experiences. I'm somebody who wants to go out and try new things and every time I go out for dinner, I want to try something new. I want to go on vacations to different places, where somebody else might be, nope, I want McDonald's every morning for breakfast. I want Burger King for lunch. And every December, we're going to Disneyland and we're going to stay in the same place. And that's it. I'm not open to new things. I like what I like. Okay, cool. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with being open. Nothing wrong with being low on openness, but it's just who we are. So it's easy to be able to identify who we might be able to be compatible with. So now, after all that, so after all that, we can finally get into the 10 personality disorders. And they're broken into cluster A, cluster B, cluster C, okay? And it goes 3, 4, 3. So A, B, C, 3, 4, 3. Cluster A are paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Don't worry, we're going to go through each of these individually, okay? So these are the odd personality disorders. Cluster B are the emotional dysregulation personality disorders, and those are antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic, okay? The one that you probably, you've probably heard of borderline. It's one that's very misunderstood. You probably understand what narcissistic personality disorder is just because you probably know at least somewhat what a narcissist is. And antisocial is probably the one that you will probably misinterpret until I tell you exactly what it's all about. Because it sounds like it's the person who wants to not, it's the introvert who doesn't want to go to the party, and that's not what it is. When you find out what an antisocial personality disorder is, you're going to want to not invite them to your party. It's a very different thing. And then the third, cluster C, is avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. That third one, first two, I only need to give you like 2 minutes on, you'll understand exactly. The OCPD is a little bit more difficult because we've already talked about something called OCD, right? OCPD, and I'll go over this in a little bit, but just to kind of give you, the idea of what it is. OCPD, if you think you're OCD, there is a way better chance you're OCPD, okay? Because when we talked about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, these are people who are debilitated because of their obsessive thoughts and their compulsive acts that try to get rid of the anxiety associated with obsessive compulsive. If you think you're OCD, or if you say, hey, I'm so OCD because I have to rearrange my DVD collection in alphabetical order, my soups are all lined up in the cabinet, my medications are in order from tallest to small, that's way more OCPD. If you're the type of person who's sitting in front of your computer screen right now and you have your notes sitting perfectly squared off and you're writing, and if you write something in the margins of your notes and you have to go back after class and rewrite the entire page because it doesn't look right, that's not OCD, that's OCPD. But we'll get into that in a little bit, okay? All right, cluster A, the odd or eccentric personality disorders. These are probably the least prevalent in the United States. And let's start out by talking about the fact that most personality disorders are well underdiagnosed. And what is the reason for that? Well, it's because it is a rarity that someone walks through the door of a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist or a social worker and identifies that they have a personality disorder. It's one of the last things people think about. Most of the time, when it's a personality disorder, it is somebody who is referred in and is coming in a lot of times against their will. Most of the times that I have seen personality disorders are when people have been referred either through employee assistance programs, EAPs, court systems, or parents or significant others. You know, I was just working with an individual, and this was kind of a pro bono thing. It was not an official client, but it was somebody that asked me for some assistance, and so I did some pro bono work with her. She was having some issues with her significant other, who was engaging in some behavior that was, you know, really questionable, specifically in the realm of a relationship. And you know, there was questions as to whether this was bipolar, was it addiction, was it, you know, what was going on. And what was really happening was it was personality disorder driven. And so in that case, I was not going to work specifically with that individual, because that individual didn't see that they were having any trouble, and they were not identifying themselves as a client. So I'm not going to go out and just tell somebody, hey, guess what, you have a personality disorder because your significant other told me all the things. That's not the way this works. But so I worked with the significant other who actually approached me about how to deal with somebody with a personality disorder, because sometimes that's the only thing you can do. Remember the 4 Ds, distress. When it comes to personality disorders, most of the time the distress is on other people, okay? So rarely is somebody going to walk in my door and say, you know what, I have an odd personality and I think it's a problem. We're going to identify these things as a part of a bigger issue. The referral source is going to be something behaviorally happened, and we're going to kind of work backwards and say, well, it's probably stemming from a personality disorder. So the first of these is paranoid personality disorder. And first off, a lot of these symptoms you're going to see, or a lot of these disorders are going to have symptoms that are very similar to what we used to call Axis 1, paranoid personality disorder. The first thing that would pop in your mind is, wait a second, paranoid, is this person schizophrenic? In short, no. Somebody with paranoid personality disorder has paranoia, but doesn't have psychosis. They're not delusional. They're not hallucinating. It's just a pattern of suspiciousness. They constantly think people are out to get them, and they think people are being malevolent or against them, okay? They're not making things up in their mind. They're just perceiving their subjective experiences that they are paranoid that other people are out to get them, okay? So you can see that this is going to be problematic for that person. But is somebody with a paranoid personality disorder going to walk into my office and say, you know what, I think people are out to get me? No, they're just going to think that's the way it is. And so it's only when an outsider identifies, hey, you know, you're really paranoid and some of these things are unfounded, that we can start working on this personality disorder, okay? Schizoid and schizotypal are a lot of times very difficult to differentiate. Schizoid is somebody who it's not an introvert extrovert thing. They're detached from social relationships, and they have a very restricted range of emotional expression. As a person who works a lot with people with developmental disabilities, specifically people within the autistic spectrum, I have a sneaking suspicion that schizoid personality disorder is present in most people that did not get diagnosed at the appropriate age for what we used to call Asperger's, or PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. But basically, in short, I have a hypothesis that schizoid personality disorder is very commonly mis- or undiagnosed autism, something within the spectrum. Because if you look at autism, you could say that they're functionally, if I'm just working with somebody with autism, their personality is disruptive, dysfunctional, dangerous, deviant, all that. And so if we didn't identify somebody, especially people who are, you know, like in their 40s or 50s today, autism wasn't a huge thing that was being looked for by pediatric psychologists and pediatricians. So if we're now seeing today that people are acting like what we're seeing people with autism acting like as they become adults, they were diagnosed with schizoid. I'm not saying that that is the only thing. There are people who probably just have schizoid personality disorder, but I really believe that this is a disorder that is kind of making up for what I think was missed Asperger's, PDD-NOS, autistic spectrum, okay? But in looking at identifying the disorder, it's really easy for you to just remember schizoid looks like autism, okay? And then schizotypal is somebody who they're not comfortable with close relationships. They have cognitive or perceptual distortions, not psychosis, but distortion, and they're eccentric. I, with all the love in my heart, use the example, and I'm not doing it to pick on people, I'm doing it so students can kind of conceptualize things. Most of my students can grasp schizotypal when I tell you, think about the weirdest science teacher you had in middle or high school. And I'm not saying that they have personality disorders, okay? But, and I pick on science teachers because I had a few myself that, you know, they were amazingly smart people, but they were eccentric. They were really, really into science, and that's not a bad thing, but they thought differently. They acted differently. They really didn't care about interpersonal relationships as much as other people might, and they were just so eccentric. That's kind of schizotypal. Now, your high school science teacher probably didn't have a personality disorder, but if there's a person who acts like that and they can't get along with other people to the point where, you know, they can't hold a job or hold a relationship if they want to, especially holding a job. I mean, they don't like close relationships to begin with, but if they can't hold a job or they can't function in society, that might be schizotypal, okay? So the difference between schizoid and schizotypal is the schizoid is going to be very subdued in their emotions. Schizotypal may be subdued, but they also may be, you know, eccentric and out there, okay? So those are your odd and eccentric, cluster A, all right? So we'll go through these very quickly because I've already talked about them, but I'm just gonna kind of post so you can see these things. The paranoid, they see a lot of hidden messages. They're easily insulted. Again, major difference here is they're not psychotic. So this isn't schizophrenia. They're not perceiving things that aren't really there. They're interpreting things that aren't really there. So they're not, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. They are perceiving things that may not be there, but they're not, the sensations are accurate. So they're not hallucinating and they're not delusional, okay? Schizoid, again, indifferent, limited social range. A lot of times when you see hoarders, they may be schizoid. They're usually OCD and schizoid because they're just kind of by themselves. They just don't seem to need anybody. They're okay. They're okay being alone. It's the step beyond introversion. It's not that they don't like being around other people. It's that they really enjoy being solitary, okay? And then the schizotypal are just the bizarre people. They're not psychotic, but they may have magical thinking. Again, Willy Wonka is a great example of the schizotypal personality. They have really odd ways of thinking, and there's no doubt that, you know, this character, you know, there's not, everything seems to be on the up and up. You know, if you were to describe Willy Wonka's factory to somebody, they would say, that's crazy, that's impossible. But then in the movie and the book, you go in and it's real. He does have Oompa Loompas, and he does have a river of chocolate, and he does have all these weird things. So he's not psychotic. In reality, he's perceiving things somewhat differently, okay? And now we get into cluster B, which is the one that we'll spend the most time on. The dramatic, the emotional, the erratic, okay? So we have antisocial, borderline, histrionic, okay? These kind of get paired together. So it's borderline and histrionic kind of pair together, antisocial and narcissistic kind of pair together. Okay, so I'm going to go through these a little bit more specifically than I will the other 6. So we'll start with antisocial. Like I said, this is the one where if you think it's the antisocial introvert, no, that's schizoid, schizotypal. Antisocial is the diagnosis that most closely is diagnostically what we would consider the vernacular term of a psychopath or a sociopath. An antisocial personality disorder is indicated by behavior that is irresponsible, sometimes impulsive, although sometimes meticulously thought out, but with a lack of caring. To the extreme versions of antisocial personality disorder, we have a lack of empathy. So if we go to the far extreme, not everybody with antisocial personality disorder is going to be a serial killer or a serial rapist or anything. But when you look at those extremes, the serial killer lacks empathy. If you or I went out and killed someone, and I'm assuming you and I do not have antisocial personality disorder, okay? we would feel badly for it. Even if it was justified, we would feel badly for it. We would be able to feel what that person felt, okay? With a lack of empathy, antisocial personality disorder, they just don't care. They use people. So the extreme of the serial killer without empathy is a good example of antisocial, but we know about 1% of the population in the United States has antisocial personality disorder. And here's what gets bizarre. Some of our most successful people in the United States are successful societally because they do have varying degrees of antisocial personality disorder. I'm not going to belabor this story because we're running out of time, but I'll give you the short version. When I was in my undergrad years, I spent 6 months as a car salesman. Not something that I usually put on my resume or CV, but you know, made decent money. I was able to study, you know, during downtime. And the reason I no longer am a car salesman is because my very last week there, I was in a situation where, this is going to sound bizarre because I have to give you the short version, but basically I accidentally sold a car to a young lady for more than what the sticker price was. And I felt horrible about it because what happened was we were negotiating on a car that wasn't on our lot. So the manager told me to go out, and the price was, give you simple numbers, the price was $20,000. He said, go out there and tell her it's $21,000. That way we can negotiate down, and you know, we can negotiate from 21 instead of 20. So I went out, said 21, and the girl just said, boom, yes, I want it, I'll buy it. So I went back and told my manager, I was like, hey, we have a problem. I just sold a car for more than what the sticker is going to say. And he looked at me dead-eyed and said, what is the problem? And I kind of was taken aback. Said, well, she's going to see the sticker and going to know that that we're charging her $1,000 more. And he said, no, she's not going to see the sticker. So you can kind of figure out where that comes from. Do I think that my manager was antisocial? I'm not going to say that. But you have to be able to, you know, I felt badly for that young lady, and that $1,000 was not going to kill her over a long period of time, but I felt bad. And so I knew that, you know, that this is not something that I could continue doing. And so, but if you look at people like Bernie Madoff, you know, a lot of you may know him. He was the guy who ran the Ponzi scheme where he took people's retirement money, and he took, I think it was like $50 billion or 30 or 20, whatever it is. It's a billion, it's more than what we can comprehend. And he was just spending it on his own. He was just out there spending it. It was a Ponzi scheme. He kept taking in more retirement funds, and he would spend it on his own, and eventually got caught, and everybody just lost their money. And he doesn't seem to care about it. That's antisocial. He doesn't care that he's hurting other people because that's what he wants, okay? So antisocial personality disorder, unfortunately, can be functional. You know, you think about some of the best business people in the world, you know, they don't care. They know that they're going to have to hurt someone else, not really hurt, but they're going to have to come with their best interest in order to, somebody else is going, it's a zero-sum game. If I'm selling you something, I want to sell it for the most money that I can, and I can't be thinking about how, you know, that's going to hurt you in some way. So they just don't have any feeling towards doing what they need to do in order to get what they want, okay? So we have our examples there. I'm gonna skip over some of these. Okay, borderline. Borderline is a disorder that has kind of become media sensationalized in the last like 10 years, primarily because of the behavior and the pattern that we're seeing in adolescence of self-harm and cutting. This stems from borderline personality disorder. That's where it kind of came from. Borderline is an instability of mood, relationships, and self-image, okay? People with borderline personality disorder tend to see everything in black and white, and they absolutely see other people as good or bad, love you or hate you, and it's transitive. So they may absolutely love you until they find out that you reciprocate that, and then they hate you because they want to push you away, and then as soon as they push you away, they love you again, okay? They see things as good and bad. They don't see shades of gray, all right? Because one of the major symptoms here is the inability to kind of feel. They're constantly feeling empty because they see the world in black and white. This is where self-harming, cutting, burning, things within that realm come into play. And it's because borderline people report that when they when they hurt themselves, they actually feel something that they don't naturally feel emotionally. And it's not necessarily the practice of actually cutting and hurting oneself. In the people that I've worked with who have borderline personality, the pain is something that a lot of them do report that they like, but it's not necessarily the pain, it's the anticipation that they're going to go through a procedure in which they will fix the pain. Because in their emotional and personality life, they can't do that. They see things as black and white, good and bad. And so when they inflict harm upon themselves, they go through a procedure of healing that and watching it heal. And it's something that they can't feel emotionally. So that's why we tend to see people with borderline personality disorder be self-harmers. It is, it's very striking when you work with somebody. The first young lady, and this does tend to be something that we see more in young females, but we are seeing more males engaging in this in the last 10 years. The first time I worked with somebody who did this, it was very jarring because I wasn't well prepared. She was a 16-year-old girl, again, didn't diagnose her with borderline, but basically knew that she was pre-borderline or going to be borderline. And she presented very normally because she could put on a very good face. And it took me about 6 months before she finally showed me. One day she came in and she had on long sleeves all the time and pants, and she pulled up her sleeve and showed me just cut after cut, and they were perfectly in line. And it was almost as if it was like on a Word, like on Microsoft Word, if you click justified, everything was meticulously lined up. And the most amazing thing to me was that she could name every single one of those cuts. She could tell me when it happened, what she was thinking, who she was mad at, and what kind of happened with each of them. And come to find out, she had them up and down her arm, she had them up and down her shoulder, she had them on her legs, but she had them almost as if you were to have like a tattoo sleeve. It was if she were to wear a long sleeve shirt and shorts, normal length shorts, you would never be able to see any of these cuts. And she had them up and down her torso. So she always could present as if she wasn't cutting. But if you kind of saw underneath the layer, you would see what was going on. And that's kind of a great visualization of what borderline is all about. Histrionic is kind of it kind of looks the same as borderline, but it's significantly different. Whereas the borderline person is very restricted in their emotionality, histrionic is extremely dramatic. Okay, so these are attention-seeking, victim, people who like to see themselves as a victim. They're very hypersexual, and it may not be the fact that they're hypersexual in that they're enjoying sex, but they use sex in order to get what they want. It's attention-seeking. It's making people think that they are a part of them, and it's trying to build a bond with somebody. But in all actuality, their emotions are incredibly shallow. They're very self-centered. Okay, so that's histrionic. And then narcissistic. Hopefully, you know that a narcissist is somebody who thinks very highly of themselves. And narcissistic personality disorder, there's nothing wrong with thinking highly of yourself, but it's when it becomes dysfunctional. When a person has narcissistic personality disorder, they're, like I said, it's very close to antisocial because there's a lack of empathy, but they also feel special and unique. So a lot of times narcissistic and antisocial will go together to make the perfect storm. Somebody who thinks that they're great and they don't care about anybody else, and they tend to play off that they don't care what other people think. They will think very highly of themselves, and if you don't like them, well, then you're stupid. You don't understand how great they are. And if you do like them, well, you're stupid too, because everybody knows I'm great. They're very entitled, but they're very fragile. They can be knocked down, and so a lot of times that antisocial comes in, and they will be petty and retributive in their actions. They'll try to get back at people. So again, there's nothing wrong with thinking highly of yourself. You know, if narcissism as an entity did not exist, nobody would be a CEO, nobody would be the president of the United States. Think about, you know, we have what, like 20,000 people running for the president right now, it feels like. But each of those persons who is running, who has announced that they want to run for the president in 2020, I'm not saying they have narcissistic personality disorder, but think about it. Don't you have to be kind of narcissistic to say, out of 350 million people, I am the one who will lead you? I am the one who is best qualified to lead all of us, to be the president. That's narcissistic. Is it narcissistic personality disorder? I would argue that in 2016, we saw, as close as we are ever going to see, two candidates running who were either bordering on narcissistic personality disorder or were full-blown, because their self-perception was so jaded that they both thought that they were the best. And I think most people would agree that we were kind of picking the lesser of two evils, or not even the lesser of two evils. We were just we were stuck with two choices that just, I don't think anybody would have wrote in. So, and maybe you would have, I don't know. But all in all, kind of looking back, I mean, out of 350 million people, is that the best we had to offer? Maybe it is, who knows? But it takes a little bit of narcissism to really believe that, hey, I'm the person, I am the one that will lead you all as the president of the United States. And finally, cluster C. And luckily, because we're running out of time, this is the short one, really simple. Avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder. For once, psychology and psychiatry made this simple for you. Avoidant personality disorder, people who avoid social interactions because they feel inadequate. Not schizoid or schizotypal because they don't like other people. Avoidant is, I'm not gonna get out there because I'm not good enough. Now, here's where, as a college student, you're all going to identify. I'm assuming. Now, last night I met a student who's coming in to college. We had IB 101 night last night for high school students, and I met a student who was excited to take speech class, and I think she was the first one I've ever met. Most people who are going into speech class develop something very similar to avoidant personality disorder. Like, I don't want to go do my speech because I'm afraid that people are going to make fun of me, that I'm going to do something wrong, that I'm going to get negative evaluation. Okay, so I avoid it. Now, just because of that, you don't have avoidant personality disorder, but you can see where somebody with avoidant personality disorder, you can kind of empathize with them because they do this with everything. Okay, dependent personality disorder is where I'm still needy, and I'm needy to the point where I'm not going to avoid. I need to cling on to somebody. Okay, so dependent personality would be, the person who constantly needs to be around a significant other or a friend or somebody. This is a great example of why we don't diagnose kids with personality disorders, because almost all kids are dependent because they have to be taken care of. If you're 45 and you're still asking mom or dad to pick out your clothes for work and cut the crust off your peanut butter, either you have the world's greatest saintly parent, or I guess either way, you do have the most saintly great parent. But if you are engaging and you need that, that's dependent, okay? And a lot of times we see this in relationships. People will find, if they have dependent personality disorder, they will tend to attract themselves, they'll attach themselves to somebody who wants a dependent person. So it's kind of the worst type of relationship, is codependency. Okay, and then finally, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And again, I've already talked about this one a little bit, but just be mindful that when somebody says, "Oh, I'm so OCD," if they're functional, they probably aren't OCD. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is the preoccupation with orderliness. If we're going to go Freudian, we would say they have that they're anal. Remember the psychosexual stages? They have an anal personality. They're anal retentive, perfectionists. This is the type of person who has a meticulous schedule, and they can't break that meticulous schedule even when it would be beneficial to them. Okay, so they must make the bed and vacuum their bedroom before they leave for school, and they look at the clock and they got a late start, and they know they're going to be late for school if they make their bed and vacuum the floor, but they have to do it. It's just part of their ritual. They have to do it. And so that's OCPD. It would be OCD if they magically thought that if they didn't vacuum the floor, then the Mount St. Helens was going to erupt, or the sun was going to stop shining, or something. There's something much more debilitating and dysfunctional and deviant about OCD. OCPD is just where your your orderliness and perfectionism is going to come at the expense of flexibility. So, OCPD actually, in some of these, actually have some benefit. Again, if I own a car dealership, I'm going to want to hire a couple of very low-level antisocial personality disorder people because I want them to not care about, how charging somebody more for a car when they're negotiating is going to harm them. I don't want bleeding heart, pacifist, human services, psychology people who are going to be empathetic towards people. I want kind of, cutthroat people. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder, if I have an accountant, I want them to be slightly OCPD because I want them to be orderly and I want them to have a preoccupation with doing my taxes perfectly. Because, I could do the math in my head and I'm just going to do this and, that'll be quicker. Well, that's flexible. But that also is the kind of thing that winds you up, getting an IRS audit and winding up, doing 3 to 5 in a federal penitentiary for tax evasion. I want some form of OCPD in my accountant. I want some form of OCPD in my neurosurgeon. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to take a chunk off the skull here and go in and poke around the brain. No, I want them to be obsessive compulsive about, hey, this is exactly where that problem is, and I'm going to go in and exactly take that out. So OCPD, and again, my neurosurgeon, I don't want them to have OCPD per se, but a little bit of the traits wouldn't be that bad. So we have to be very mindful that some of these personality traits are not necessarily disorders, and the disorders are the point at which they are dysfunctional.